The snow had fallen soft and steady for most of the morning in Hanover, New Hampshire. On January 27, 2001, the small Ivy League town looked like something from a New England postcard. Powdered rooftops, bare maple trees arching over frozen streets, and smoke drifting lazily from chimneys. Inside the homes that lined the quiet woods outside Dartmouth College, firewood crackled in iron stoves and books lined the shelves. Warmth, scholarship, and quiet prosperity wrapped the community like a blanket. Half Zantop, a beloved professor of earth sciences at Dartmouth, was in his study. Sunlight cut through the frost-laced windows, glinting off his glasses as he read through a thick academic journal. His wife, Suzanne, herself a respected German studies professor, was bustling in the kitchen, humming softly, a habit she'd never quite shaken from her childhood in Berlin. It was a Saturday, the kind of day that begged for nothing but slippers, strong coffee, and pages turning slowly. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. Half glanced up, curious. Unscheduled visits weren't common. He got up, crossed a hallway, and opened the front door to find two teenagers, polite, clean-cut, and lightly flushed from the cold. One held a clipboard. They introduced themselves as James and Robert, students conducting a survey on environmental policy for a school project. Half invited them in. The boys smiled. Everything about them said safe. They wore windbreakers, carried pens, asked smart questions. Suzanne brought out a pot of tea. Less than 20 minutes later, both professors would be dead, killed in their own home in an act so brutal, so unprovoked, that seasoned homicide detectives would later call it one of the most calculated crimes they had ever encountered. Not because it was chaotic or rage-fueled, but because it wasn't. It was cold, intentional, practiced, and the killers? Just two high school boys who thought they had planned the perfect murder. It wasn't until 6:15 p.m. that anyone suspected something was wrong. That evening, friends of Zantop's arrived for dinner, a casual gathering scheduled days earlier. When they knocked, no one answered. Odd, but perhaps they'd lost track of time. After repeated calls and no signs of life, they checked the door. It was unlocked. They stepped inside. What they found would never leave them. The air was eerily still, the heat still humming. Inside the study, the scene was soaked in blood. Half's body lay face down between a shattered coffee table and a pool of crimson. Suzanne, barely feet away, lay slumped in the entryway to the kitchen, her hands outstretched as if crawling. 911 was called at 6:27 p.m. Hanover police arrived within minutes. Within an hour, the New Hampshire State Police Major Crimes Unit had taken over the scene. Lead investigator Lieutenant Tom Williams stood quietly in the entryway as crime scene technicians snapped photos, logged blood trails, and dusted every surface for prints. The first observation was of violence. Both victims had been stabbed repeatedly, over and over. The sheer number of wounds suggested either uncontrolled rage or deliberate overkill. But there was something else. No sign of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no missing valuables. Nothing made sense. No robbery, no sexual assault, just death. Fast, frenzied, and surgical. The crime scene team recovered several critical pieces of evidence that first night. Among them, a bloody footprint not belonging to either victim, a tan sheath for a K-bar combat knife, and in the hallway closet, dropped hastily, was a clipboard containing survey papers with the names James and Robert printed faintly on the top. They had left their names, their first names. Right there, it was either stunning arrogance or the mark of two young killers who thought they were too smart to get caught. By Sunday morning, the story was already spreading across town. Dartmouth professors killed in their home without warning. Local media described the Zantops as pillars of the academic community, and the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. Students held impromptu vigils. Candles glowed in windows. The college shut down classes that Monday. Investigators began quietly pulling every string. They interviewed neighbors, family, friends. The Zantops had no enemies, no troubled relatives, No feuds. They lived a quiet, comfortable life in academia. The working theory shifted. This was random. That terrified everyone. What they didn't know, yet, was that the killers had already disappeared across state lines. Back in Chelsea, Vermont, just 90 minutes from Hanover, high school senior Robert Tulloch sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. He had showered twice that night, cleaned his fingernails, washed the soles of his boots with bleach. He'd buried the knife in the woods behind his house. His friend James Parker was just 16, a quiet sophomore with a crooked smile and a deep need to impress. James had always looked up to Robert, who was confident, articulate, and obsessed with philosophy and grand ideals. Together, they read Nietzsche. They debated ethics over Mountain Dew. They considered themselves smarter than everyone around them. Months earlier, Robert had proposed an idea, a plan to rob wealthy people, get cash, and flee to Australia, start a new life off the grid. James went along with it. At first, it was just theory. But then Robert bought knives online, practiced stabbing trees, chose the Xantops at random from a local directory. They're professors, he told James. They've got money, no risk. They didn't think it through. Not really. But they practiced, rehearsed how they'd ask to come inside, what they'd say, how they'd do it quickly, cleanly, and escape. And somehow they did. On Monday morning, the clipboard became the breakthrough. FBI analysts enhanced the faint writing left on the survey sheet. Pressure indents from pages above it. The names James Parker and Robert Tulloch were clearly visible. That led detectives to Chelsea, where both boys lived. Quiet surveillance began. Investigators didn't want to move too fast. They needed physical evidence. On Tuesday, detectives interviewed both boys separately. James was nervous, inconsistent, claimed he didn't remember what he did Saturday, said he was at home, then said he was with Robert, then changed his story again. Robert, on the other hand, was calm, cold. He told them he had spent Saturday preparing for a debate tournament. I never left town, he said. I've never even been to Hanover. But behind his house, hidden beneath a tarp, police found a small camping shovel and freshly disturbed soil. Inside it, a blood-stained knife and latex gloves. Before they could return to arrest him, Robert and James vanished. A nationwide manhunt was launched within hours. They were last seen boarding a bus in Lebanon, New Hampshire. They had packed backpacks with trail mix, maps, and burner phones. They were headed west, changing names, ditching clothes, sleeping under bridges. But they were 16 and 17. They weren't hardened fugitives. They used cash from their parents. They bought food with debit cards. And on February 19th, just 23 days after the murders, they were caught in an Indiana truck stop. They had run out of money. They were tired. And James, on the verge of collapse, confessed. He cried. He said Robert had convinced him. Said he hadn't wanted to stab anyone, but once Robert did, he had to follow through. Back in New Hampshire, Lieutenant Williams stood quietly when a call came in. Both suspect in custody. Evidence found. Confessions pending. The air was heavy. A seasoned detective later said, "You expect monsters to look like monsters, not like kids." The manhunt ended at a truck stop in Indiana. Cold wind swept through the parking lot as authorities approached two boys, James Parker, 16, and Robert Tulloch, 17, who'd been missing from Chelsea, Vermont. They were hungry, unshowered, quiet. The moment they were asked their names, they didn't run. They simply nodded. It was over. Back in New Hampshire, police already had a grim picture forming. What they needed now was confirmation, the why, the how, and whether either of them felt anything about what they'd done. The murders professors Half and Suzanne Xantop weren't impulsive. They weren't the result of mental illness or a heated argument gone wrong. They were, in every forensic detail, planned. From the fake survey papers to the purchase of K-Bar combat knives online, this crime had been weeks in the making. It had started, according to interviews, as an idea between two bored, arrogant teenagers. Robert Tulloch, intelligent, charismatic, manipulative, had long expressed a desire to escape America and live off the grid somewhere exotic. Australia, he had said, maybe Thailand. But they needed money to do that. A lot of it. Robert believed they could get it by robbing rich people, strangers, and making it look clean. He had already recruited James Parker, a quiet, thoughtful sophomore who idolized him. Their friendship was intense, one-sided. James, under Robert's influence, would later say, "I wanted to impress him. I thought I'd disappoint him if I backed out." The Xantops were chosen at random. College professors, living just across the Vermont-New Hampshire border. Educated, presumably wealthy, kind, the perfect marks. The boys practiced how they'd speak, what questions to ask, how to move quickly once they were inside. They carried survey clipboards to hide the knives. They even rehearsed it on other families in nearby towns in the days leading up to the murders. On January 27, 2001, they rang the Xantops' doorbell just after noon. The professors, warm and generous, welcomed them in, offered tea, sat politely as they answered questions about the environment. For 20 minutes, it looked and felt like any other afternoon in an academic household. Then Robert gave James a signal. A glance. James stood. Robert pulled out his knife and struck half Xantop in the chest, killing him almost instantly. Suzanne ran into the room and screamed. James, now panicking, stabbed her repeatedly until she fell. Within minutes, they were gone, bloody clothes hidden, knives wiped, cash stolen. They had left behind a single clue, the clipboard with faint imprint of their names on the survey page beneath. Forensics would later reveal blood spattered beneath the desk, cast-off patterns on the walls, and bruising consistent with a desperate fight. There had been resistance, screaming, violence, but there were no witnesses. No neighbors heard the attack. It took police only days to trace the names to Chelsea. When detectives interviewed the boys, their alibis were weak. James broke quickly, shaken by guilt. Robert was colder, calculated. He denied everything. But in the woods behind Robert's house, police found the buried murder weapon, still sticky with blood. That sealed it. In court, the facts unfolded with devastating clarity. James had cooperated, accepting a plea deal and testifying against Robert. He described how Robert had planned everything, how he'd pressured him, how he'd said it would be easy, that the Xantops wouldn't even see it coming. But the jury saw something else too. Both boys had agreed to go. Both had brought knives. Both had killed. Robert Tulloch was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. James Parker, as part of his plea, was sentenced to 25 years to life for second-degree murder. Both were tried as adults. Both would spend most, if not all, of their lives in prison. What haunted the community most wasn't just the loss of two cherished professors. It was how senseless, how methodical, how empty the motive had been. The Xantops had opened their home to strangers, trusted them, and died because of that decency. In the years since, the story has become a cautionary tale taught in police academies and criminal justice courses. It reminds investigators to look closely at the people who seem least likely. It reminds parents that influence, no matter how subtle, can push a child toward darkness when mixed with ego and fantasy. It reminds all of us that evil sometimes doesn't scream. It smiles. It's articulate. It walks into your living room with a clipboard and asks a question about recycling and leaves you bleeding on the floor. There are no happy endings here. Only the silence of a brilliant couple taken too soon. Only a town forever changed. And two teenagers who thought they'd disappear into the world, but instead left a trail written in blood and arrogance. Justice wasn't about revenge, one retired detective would later say. It was about naming what happened and making sure no one ever forgets.